The rookie doctor is about to discover the biggest secret of his life. But this time, what he'll be fighting isn't just death, but humanity's darkest side. If you're ready, here begins a story that will both move you to tears and remind you of the power of hope. The sun had not yet fully risen when Dr. Hugo Santamaria walked through the hospital doors, adjusting his gown while discreetly yawning. The previous day had been difficult, but he was already accustomed to the pain, the exhaustion, the daily struggle to save lives. It was all part of what he had chosen when he decided to become a doctor. He barely had time to take a deep breath before he heard the hurried footsteps of a nurse. "Doctor, emergency in pediatrics," she said breathlessly. Hugo's heart raced. He knew that urgency well. Without thinking twice, he hurried down the hallway, passing patients and family members huddled in uncomfortable chairs. As soon as he entered the treatment room, what he saw made his stomach churn. Two tiny babies, only a few days old, were lying on small stretchers. The air around them felt heavier. They were twins, and they were pale, breathing weakly. They looked like porcelain dolls. Their fragile little bodies trembled slightly, wrapped in thin, dirty blankets. The nurses worked quickly, adjusting monitors, preparing IVs, trying to stabilize them. Hugo approached immediately. "What happened?" he asked as he carefully placed his hand on one of the babies' chests to feel their breath. A nurse looked at him with concern. They were found unconscious with severe signs of malnutrition. "We have no information about the parents." Hugo frowned. No information. He looked around for a family member. That's when he saw an elderly woman huddled in a corner of the room with her hands clasped as if she were praying. Her face was marked by time, and her swollen eyes betrayed her tears. He approached her calmly. "Ma'am, did you bring these babies?" The woman raised her head and looked at him with tears in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice came out broken, as if each word hurt. "Please, doctor, they have to live." He quickly put on his gloves and touched the little hand of one of the babies. It was cold. "We have to act fast," he said to the team. "We have to warm these babies up, start hydration, and monitor their oxygenation." The nurses rushed to follow his orders, and he turned to the elderly woman again. She was trembling, her fingers twisted with nerves. "Ma'am, tell me what happened to them. Are they your grandchildren?" She shook her head slowly, as if she didn't have the strength to answer. Her eyes were so red that it looked like she had been crying all night. "I'm not their grandmother, but they had no one else, doctor. They had no one else." Her voice broke with pain. Hugo knelt beside her, trying to be as kind as possible. "How did they come to you? Where are their parents?" She swallowed hard. The wrinkles on her face deepened as she clasped her hands together, as if trying to hold something inside her. "I found them. God forgive me. I found them abandoned. All alone. They were dying, doctor." Hugo felt a lump in his throat. "Abandoned? Where?" She closed her eyes. For a moment, as if reliving the moment in an old abandoned house in a remote neighborhood. "I went there for another reason, but when I heard faint cries, I went to look and found them almost lifeless." Hugo took a deep breath. He couldn't imagine the horror of a newborn being left to die. His blood boiled in his veins, but he remained calm. It was not a time for anger. It was a time to save those babies. He stood up and looked at his team. "They need urgent nutrition. We're going to do a complete examination. I want to know exactly how long they've been without food." The nurse at his side frowned. "Doctor, their condition is very serious. We don't know if they'll survive." Hugo looked again at those two helpless children. They were only a few days old. Perhaps they had never even felt the warmth of a mother's embrace. They hadn't even had the chance to live, and already they were facing the difficulties of a cruel world. He approached the stretcher and whispered in a voice full of promise, "You're going to hold on. I'm going to take care of you. I swear." Doña Estela's trembling hands gripped Hugo's hand tightly. Her fingers were cold, almost as cold as those of the babies fighting for survival on the stretcher. Her gaze was that of someone who had seen a lot of pain in her life, but nothing that could compare to this. "Please, doctor, tell me they're going to be okay." Her voice broke at the end of the sentence, and she closed her eyes tightly, holding back the tears that could no longer be contained. Hugo felt a lump in his throat. He looked at the little ones once more, so fragile, so helpless. He took a deep breath and held her hand gently. "I'll do everything I can. but I need to know who their parents are. Where is the house where you found them?" The question seemed to fall like a stone on Doña Estela. Her shoulders slumped and she lowered her head. A sob escaped her before she could contain it. Hugo waited, giving her a moment, but his silence began to make Doña Estela uncomfortable. She tried again, this time more forcefully. "Brothers," and she bowed her head. A sob escaped her before she could hold it back. Hugo waited, giving her a moment, but her silence began to make him uncomfortable. Doña Estela tried again, this time more gently. "These babies didn't just appear here out of nowhere. You are responsible for everything that has happened to them, as far as we know. If someone abandoned them, we need to know who it was. Yes, if there is a mother, she may need help. If there is a father." Doña Estela closed her eyes, and a thick tear rolled down her weathered face. She didn't answer, she just cried, silently, as if she were carrying a burden too heavy to share with anyone. Hugo felt a chill run through him. Something was very wrong. Meanwhile, Hugo watched the nurses work quickly to connect the little ones to the equipment that could help them fight for their lives. The machines beeped at different rhythms. The thin tubes carried serum to those fragile veins, but something began to bother him, something he couldn't ignore. He approached the babies again and looked at them more closely, gently touching their arms, and then their little legs. What he saw turned his stomach. The little ones' bodies had dark marks, bruises scattered across their thin skin. Some small wounds looked like recent scratches. There was redness on their wrists, as if someone had held them too tightly. Hugo's heart beat faster. This was not normal, not in such small babies. He lifted the blanket covering them a little more and felt a lump in his throat. Their ribs were visible, their tummies sunken. They were so malnourished that it looked like they hadn't eaten in days. He looked at one of the nurses who had also noticed. "Doctor," his voice sounded urgent. Hugo took a deep breath, trying to contain the anger that was beginning to grow inside him. He didn't like to jump to conclusions, but everything indicated that these babies had not been cared for with love. So once the little ones were stable, he left the neonatal ICU and went straight to the hospital administration. He needed to see their records. He needed to know where their parents were. At the reception desk, a middle-aged woman named Rosa looked at him strangely when he asked for the records, sir. "What happened, doctor? Is there a problem with the babies?" Hugo took a deep breath. They arrived in serious condition, with no family and no information. "I need to know where their parents are. Look for twins born last week." Rosa frowned with concern and began typing into the system. After a few seconds, she shook her head. "That's strange. They were born here a few days ago, but they weren't admitted. They were taken away." Shortly after the birth, Hugo's heart skipped a beat. Who took them? Rosa turned the screen toward him. The name that appeared made his blood run cold. Dr. Ricardo Gutierrez, one of the most respected doctors at the hospital, a renowned surgeon, a professional whom everyone admired. Hugo felt a chill. Why would he take the babies? "He's their father," Rosa nodded, but her expression became even stranger when she saw the rest of the file. "The mother is a young woman, Juliana Herrera, 21 years old." Hugo frowned. He didn't know any Juliana. "And where is she?" Rosa was silent for a moment, then replied hesitantly, "There is no information about her after the birth." Hugo felt a lump in his throat. "What do you mean, no information?" Rosa shrugged nervously. "The system only says that she gave birth and shortly after, the babies were handed over to Dr. Ricardo, but there is no record of her discharge, no postpartum exams." Hugo leaned on the counter, feeling a chill run down his spine. Juliana had disappeared from the hospital without a trace, and now, a few days later, her children were on the verge of death. This was no coincidence. Something terrible had happened. Hugo left the hospital ward with his mind racing. Something was very wrong, and he couldn't ignore it. He took out his cell phone and looked for Dr. Ricardo Gutierrez's number in his contact list. His finger hesitated for a second before pressing the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Hugo's chest tightened. A respected doctor like Ricardo would not disappear like this, much less with his newborn children on the brink of death. He needed to talk to him. He needed answers. Without wasting any time, he grabbed his car keys and left the hospital. Mexico City was always bustling with activity, but at that moment, everything felt suffocating to Hugo, as if the world had become too small for the weight he was carrying. When he arrived at Ricardo's address, he parked in front of the house and looked through the window. The gate was closed. There were no lights on. He got out and rang the doorbell. He waited. Nothing. He rang again, this time more forcefully. Ricardo called out, knocking on the gate. "I need to talk to you." Silence was the only response. Hugo felt a chill down his spine. His instincts told him that something was very wrong. Why would an experienced doctor take his children out of the hospital without the necessary care? Because Juliana had disappeared without a trace. And even if Ricardo was a concerned father, where was he now? Hugo returned to the hospital with a restless mind. The silence at Ricardo's house. The phone turned off. The babies in critical condition. It all formed a terrifying puzzle. He needed answers. As soon as he entered the ICU, he found Doña Estela sitting in a corner, her eyes still red from crying. She was looking at the babies through the glass, clasping her hands in her lap as if she were praying silently. Hugo walked toward her, trying to keep his voice steady, but not abrupt. "Doña Estela, I need you to tell me the truth. This story is very poorly told. You are the mother of these children. You know where she is, right?" Doña Estela opened her eyes wide and looked away, clenching her hands even tighter. I don't know, doctor." Hugo sighed and knelt down in front of her to be at her level. "Don't lie to me. These babies almost died. You found them. You tried to save them. I know you want what's best for them, so please help me. Where is Juliana?" Doña Estela trembled from head to toe upon hearing that name. What she was hiding seemed too serious. She bit her lip, looked at the babies again, and finally murmured in a weak voice, "The last time I saw Juliana was..." When she entered Dr. Ricardo's house, Hugo felt a chill run down his spine. When was that? "A few days ago, after the birth." Doña Estela swallowed hard and closed her eyes tightly. "But she never left there, doctor. Never again." The answer fell on Hugo like a stone on his chest. Juliana had entered Ricardo's house and disappeared. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the whirlwind of thoughts. He wasted no time, rushing down the hospital corridor, dodging patients and nurses until he reached the administration office. The door was ajar, and he entered without further ado. "Rosa, I need your help now." The receptionist was startled by the urgency in his voice. "What's going on, doctor?" "I need the security camera footage from the maternity ward from the day Juliana gave birth. I need to see who left with those babies. It was Dr. Ricardo." Rosa frowned, but quickly typed into the system. "I'll look for the videos, but can you tell me what's going on?" Hugo didn't take his eyes off the computer screen. "I just need to confirm something." The seconds seemed like an eternity, until the videos loaded. Rosa clicked, and the video began to play. Hugo leaned toward the screen, and what he saw turned his stomach. In the image, Ricardo was leaving the hospital in a hurry, wearing a dark coat, his expression serious, as if he wanted to go unnoticed. In his arms was a small white bundle, the babies. He left alone, without Juliana by his side, without any nurses accompanying him, as if he were fleeing. Hugo swallowed hard and leaned back a little. "I want to see what happened to Juliana." Rosa fast-forwarded the video a few minutes. Hugo's heart almost stopped. Hours after Ricardo left, in the early hours of the morning, Juliana appeared on the screen, but she was not well. 2 unknown men were holding her by the arms. She seemed unconscious, her head falling to one side. No hospital employee intervened. No alarm sounded. They simply took her away, as if she were just another patient going home. But Hugo knew that was not the case. He clenched his fists, his blood boiling. Juliana didn't leave there of her own free will. They took her away, and now, days later, she still hadn't returned, and no one knew where she was. He ran his hand over his face, trying to calm his breathing. But how could he calm down? His children had been left to die. If someone was capable of doing that to 2 defenseless babies, what could they have done to the mother? Hugo stood up suddenly, causing the chair to scrape against the floor. "Rosa, I need call the police now. Dr. Ricardo has committed crimes here." She looked at him with concern. "Doctor, are you sure Dr. Ricardo is a monster?" If it's a mistake, Hugo turned to her with eyes full of rage and anguish. A mistake? The babies almost died. Juliana disappeared. Do you think this is a coincidence? Rosa remained silent, but her gaze showed that she also felt that something was very wrong. Hugo left the room with quick steps. He walked through the hospital corridors without looking to the sides. With each step, his anguish grew. He entered the neonatal unit again and stopped in front of the little ones. Matteo and Gael slept connected to the machines. So fragile, so small. Hugo clenched his fists with the cell phone in his hand, ready to call the police. But before he could make the call, a firm voice stopped him. Dr. Santamaria, a word. He turned and saw the hospital director, Dr. Alvaro Mendoza, standing in the middle of the hallway. The man crossed his arms and frowned, as if he already knew what Hugo was about to do. I'm busy, doctor. This can't wait. The director took a step forward and lowered his voice. Actually, it can and must wait. I heard that you are investigating Dr. Ricardo and that you are thinking of involving the police. Hugo felt his blood boil. I'm not thinking of involving the police. I'm going to do it. 2 babies almost died. Their mother disappeared. Don't you find that suspicious? The director kept his gaze steady. You're accusing one of our best doctors, Santamaria. Think carefully before you ruin his career and yours. Hugo took a step forward, looking him straight in the eye. Are you listening to what I'm saying? 2 innocent lives were left to die, and the mother, my God, do you really want to protect someone who may have done something terrible? The director took a deep breath deeply, as if choosing his words carefully. The hospital cannot be involved in scandals without concrete evidence. We cannot act on suspicion alone. Hugo laughed humorlessly. So you want me to sit idly by and wait until it's too late? The director looked at him for a moment, and then sighed. I'm warning you, Hugo. Think carefully before you continue with this. He gave him one last serious look and walked away, leaving Hugo there with his hands trembling with rage. But the director's warning only achieved one thing in him. It strengthened his resolve. Hugo left the hospital with a heavy heart. The director's warning still echoed in his head, but he didn't care about anything in the world. He would not give up seeking justice for those babies, and for Juliana. With trembling hands, he took his cell phone and dialed the police. The phone rang several times before a voice answered on the other Mexico City Police Station. What is the emergency? Hugo took a deep breath. My name is Dr. Hugo Santamaria. I am a doctor at the General Hospital. I need to report the disappearance of a patient. Can you give me her name and the circumstances? Juliana Herrera gave birth to twins a few days ago and disappeared. Shortly afterwards, the babies were found in critical condition, almost lifeless, and there are images showing that she was taken from the hospital unconscious by 2 unknown men. The police officer on the other side remained silent for a moment. Doctor, Mrs. Juliana was a patient or worker at the hospital, a 21-year-old woman who simply disappeared. Hugo's voice came out louder than he wanted it to. A family member reported her disappearance. Hugo closed his eyes, trying to control his anger. She has no one, only her children who almost died. The police officer sighed. Doctor, please understand. We cannot consider a person missing without a formal report from the family. And regarding the babies, the police can only intervene if there is evidence of a crime. Are you sure it wasn't a case of parental negligence? Hugo felt his blood boil. How can it be negligence if the babies were abandoned to die and the mother disappeared without explanation? I have evidence. The hospital cameras show that she was taken against her will. The police officer hesitated. We can open a report, but without concrete evidence of a crime, our action will be limited for now. Hugo gripped the phone tightly. That means you're not going to do anything. It means that for now, we can only file the report until we have access to the camera videos and more details. Hugo closed his eyes, feeling frustration wash over him. How was it possible that no one was taking seriously what was happening? How could they ignore the lives of Juliana and those babies? But he wouldn't stop there. If the police didn't want to act, he would find the answers himself. Hugo returned to the hospital feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The police wouldn't do anything for now, but he still had 2 little ones fighting for their lives in there. As soon as he entered the neonatal unit, his gaze went straight to the incubators. Matteo and Gael were there surrounded by wires, still fragile, but something different caught his attention. The monitor that had been beeping irregularly now showed a more stable heartbeat. Their previously pale skin seemed to take on a little more color. A nurse approached and smiled. "They're responding, doctor. It's still early, but they're getting stronger." Hugo let out a long sigh. For the first time, he felt a little relief. He approached Matteo and touched his little hand. His tiny fingers moved slightly, and that was enough to make a lump form in his throat. He looked at Gail, who was breathing more easily than before. "They're strong," he murmured. That night, Hugo decided he wouldn't leave. He took a chair, sat down between the incubators, and stayed on guard, never looking away. With each beat of the little hearts, he felt his own breathing calm a little more. When dawn arrived, he realized he was holding the two babies' little hands without even noticing. Matteo and Gael were beginning to respond, and he knew deep in his heart that it wasn't just because of the medical treatment. They were fighting because they knew they were no longer alone. The early morning was silent. Hugo had lost count of how many cups of coffee he had drunk, but he wouldn't leave for anything. The monitors beeped at regular intervals, bringing some relief. Matteo and Gael were reacting, still fragile but alive. Then suddenly the sound changed. An alarm went off. Hugo's heart froze. He jumped up and looked at Matteo's monitor. The line that had been oscillating was now straight. The baby was no longer breathing. No, no, no. He opened the incubator with trembling hands. "Give me space," he shouted to the nearest nurse, who was already running to help Hugo. Tilted Matteo's small body, massaging his chest carefully, trying to get his lungs to work again. "Come on, little one. Stay with me." The seconds seemed like an eternity. He applied resuscitation techniques, adjusted the oxygen, tried everything. Every second without a response was like a knife in his chest. "Breathe, Matteo." That's when a low sound echoed through the room, a faint moan. Hugo saw Matteo's small chest rise and fall. The monitors began to register a heartbeat again. He let out such a deep sigh that he almost lost his balance. The nurse at his side wiped the sweat from her forehead. That was close. Hugo looked at the baby, who was now breathing with difficulty, but breathing nonetheless. Something inside him stirred in a strange way. Matteo was getting better. How had he suddenly stopped breathing? The question kept running through his head. That same morning, he gathered the neonatal ICU team and got straight to the point. From now on, access to the twins is restricted. Only authorized doctors and nurses can approach them. I want the cameras running all the time, and any strange movements must be reported immediately. The head nurse, an experienced woman named Lourdes, crossed her arms and looked at him curiously. "What's going on, doctor?" Hugo took a deep breath. "I don't know yet, but I have a bad feeling, and I'm not taking any chances." Lourdes exchanged a worried glance with the other nurses, but nodded in agreement. "We'll keep our eyes open." That day passed more slowly than usual. Hugo hardly left the baby's side. He reviewed the tests and checked on them from a small sofa inside the ICU, leaving the door ajar. Exhaustion finally overcame him, and he fell asleep. But something woke him in the middle of the night. A subtle noise, a sound that shouldn't have been there. He slowly opened his eyes, his heart racing. Through the crack in the door, he saw a shadow moving near the entrance to the neonatal unit. Someone was trying to get in. Hugo jumped up, his heart pounding. He rushed to the door and threw it open, but all he saw was a silhouette escaping down the dark hallway. Hugo's heart pounded in his chest. The silhouette was running fast. Without thinking, he ran after it. "Hey, stop right there!" he shouted. The intruder's footsteps echoed on the cold floor. He was agile, moving quickly, like someone who already knew exactly where to escape. Hugo struggled to follow him, dodging equipment carts and the few employees who were still on duty. But before he could catch up, the man turned a corner and disappeared into the darkness. Hugo stopped, panting, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. He looked around. The hospital was silent. The only sound was his own rapid breathing. Then something on the floor caught his attention. Near the door to the neonatal ICU, a small syringe glinted in the dim light of the hallway. He bent down slowly and picked up the object carefully. The syringe still had traces of a clear liquid in it. Hugo frowned his brow. This was not just a simple medication. He walked quickly to the nurse's station and found Lourdes, the head nurse, who was reviewing some files. "Lourdes, I need you to analyze this now. he said, handing her the syringe. She took the object with surprise. Where did you find this? Someone tried to enter the ICU. When they fled, they left this on the floor. Lourdes took the syringe to a table and used a small device to analyze its contents. After a few seconds, her face paled. This is a sedative, Hugo, and not just any sedative. If it had been injected into a newborn. She didn't finish the sentence. It wasn't necessary, Hugo. I already knew. Matteo and Gael wouldn't have survived. He clenched his fists, feeling rage coursing through his body. Someone wanted those babies to die, and he wasn't going to allow it. The syringe with the sedative was still in his hands when he heard footsteps echoing in the hallway. He raised his head, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to slow down. Ricardo Gutierrez had just entered the hospital. The man he had been searching for days was finally there, walking toward the doctor's room as if nothing had happened. But he was no longer the same Ricardo as before. Deep dark circles under his eyes made his face look older. His gown was wrinkled, as if he had put it on in a hurry, and his eyes. Hugo had seen many empty stares in his life, but this one was different, cold and lifeless. Hugo clenched his fists and walked toward him without hesitation. Ricardo stopped and looked at him in surprise. Holy Mary. But before he could react, Hugo grabbed him by the collar of his gown and pushed him against the wall. You think no one knows what you did? What you did to Juliana? Ricardo's gaze didn't change. He blinked slowly, as if processing the question. What are you talking about? Hugo tightened his grip on the fabric of his robe. You know perfectly well what I'm talking about. I saw the cameras. You left the hospital with the babies in your arms, and shortly after, 2 men took Juliana away unconscious. Now she's disappeared. And this, Hugo said, holding up the syringe. Ricardo said nothing. His face showed neither fear nor anger, only a strange weariness, as if he knew this moment would come. Where is she? Hugo shouted. Ricardo let out a long sigh and forced a crooked smile. You wouldn't understand, Santa Maria. Some mothers just weren't born to be mothers. Hugo felt a chill down his spine at those words spoken so casually. He looked directly into Ricardo's eyes and knew in that instant that he was facing a monster. He tightened his grip on the other man's doctor's neck, with rage burning in his chest. What did you do to her? Where is she? Ricardo didn't look away. On the contrary, his smile grew a little, as if he found it all funny. Why do you care so much? Hugo tilted his head slightly. They're just a woman taking advantage, and some babies, you know. How many die every day? Do you really think 2 more would make a difference in the world? Hugo felt his stomach churn. The coldness in Ricardo's voice was something he had never heard before. You're talking about your own children? Ricardo shouted. He shrugged slowly, as if it didn't matter to him. I never wanted those children. They shouldn't have been born. He lied. Fury rose through Hugo's body like an uncontrollable fire. He grabbed Ricardo by the collar of his robe and pushed him harder against the wall. And what did you do to her? Ricardo didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at Hugo, as if deciding whether it was worth telling the truth, until he finally muttered contemptuously, I just solved a problem. Hugo felt his blood boil. Those words echoed in Hugo's mind like poison. He slowly let go of Ricardo, but not because he was calmer. On the contrary, the disgust and rage inside him were so great that his hands trembled. He looked into that man's eyes and saw something terrifying. He saw emptiness. There was no love, no concern. That man did not see Matteo and Gail as his children. He saw them as a mistake, and mistakes, for him, had to be eliminated. Hugo felt his stomach churn. The image of the helpless babies in the ICU filled his mind. The way they arrived at the hospital, weak, hungry, on the verge of death. Now it all made sense. Ricardo wanted them to die. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't negligence. It was intentional. Hugo clenched his fists. You have no soul, do you? He muttered. Ricardo smiled sidelong without saying anything. Hugo wanted to scream. He wanted to lunge at him. He wanted to demand answers until he confessed everything, but he knew he couldn't lose control. He took a deep breath and took a step back. You're not going to get away with this. I swear. Ricardo just adjusted his robe as if the conversation meant anything to him. "We'll see, Santa Maria. We'll see." Hugo needed nothing more to be sure. Every second that passed was a risk. He wouldn't let Ricardo leave, not after everything he had heard. His heart racing, he turned toward the reception desk and shouted, "Security!" The employees around him stopped what they were doing. 2 security guards appeared at the end of the hallway, walking quickly toward him. Ricardo raised his eyebrows in surprise, but he didn't seem scared. "This is ridiculous," Santa Maria said, calmly adjusting his robe. Hugo stepped forward, pointing at him. "You're not going anywhere. The police are on their way." The guard stopped next to Hugo, waiting for an order. "Stop," he said mockingly. "Do you really think they'll believe you? I'm a respected doctor. You have no proof." Hugo clenched his fists. "I have the babies alive. I have the camera footage. I have the syringe with the sedative. You're not going to get away with this." The guards exchanged glances, realizing the situation was serious. One of them grabbed Ricardo by the arm, but he didn't resist. "This is absurd. With the sedative, you're not going to get away with this." The guards exchanged glances, realizing that the situation was serious. One of them grabbed Ricardo by the arm, but he didn't resist. "This is absurd," he muttered without showing concern. Hugo took out his cell phone and quickly dialed the police. "Hello, this is Hugo Santa Maria. I need a patrol car at the hospital immediately. The man responsible for the disappearance of Juliana Herrera and the attempted murder of the twins is here." On the other end of the line, the response was quick. "We're on our way." Hugo hung up and looked at Ricardo. "It's over for you, Ricardo." Ricardo just smiled slightly, as if he didn't care, but Hugo wasn't fooled. He knew that this man was hiding much more than he appeared to, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Without wasting any time, he ran through the hallways until he found Doña Estela, who was sitting on one of the hospital benches, holding a rosary between her fingers. She was looking at the floor, murmuring something softly, as if she were praying. He knelt in front of her and took her hands. "Doña Estela, please. I need to know everything. You have to tell me the truth. Now the police need all the information to catch Ricardo." She looked up slowly, her face pale with deep dark circles under her eyes. "I already told you everything I know, Dr. Hugo." He held her hands more firmly. "No, you know more. I can see it in your eyes. Please, Doña Estela. Juliana could still be alive, but I need the truth to save her. Help me." The woman trembled, and tears began to fall. "Hugo!" Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. "I promise I'll protect you," Hugo said firmly. "But if I don't know everything, it may be too late." Doña Estela took a deep breath and in a weak voice began to speak. "I was cleaning the house, and I heard that man talking on the phone days ago. He was angry. He said that Juliana would no longer be a problem, that he would soon get his wife back, that everything would return to normal." Hugo felt a knot in his stomach. He said that? He talked about Juliana like that? Doña Estela nodded and wiped her tears. "But it wasn't just that, doctor. He also talked about the babies. He said they needed to live, that they were just a mistake he wanted to erase." Hugo felt like he couldn't breathe. That was more than abandonment. Ricardo wanted Juliana to disappear. Ricardo wanted the babies to die. Hugo stood up suddenly. "Thank you, Doña Estela. You did the right thing." She grabbed his arm tightly. "You're going to find Juliana, right?" Hugo looked her in the eyes and nodded. "Yes, I swear I will." He turned and started running. Now he had everything he needed for the police to take action, and he wouldn't stop until he found Juliana alive. This time, the police couldn't ignore him until they had all the evidence in their hands. He had Doña Estela's confession. He had the babies fighting for their lives. He had Ricardo detained at the hospital. "Listen carefully," he said in a firm voice, trying to contain his urgency. "I have a doctor here who confessed that he wanted to get rid of the mother of his children. A witness heard everything. He said that Juliana would no longer be a problem." The police officer on the other end of the line was silent for a moment, and then replied, "Where was that woman last seen entering her house?" Hugo closed his eyes for a second, feeling the anxiety grow. After that, she disappeared. If she's still alive, she could be there. A few more seconds of silence passed. "We're going to send a patrol car," Hugo exhaled, not even realizing that he was holding it in. "I'll meet you here at the hospital to go with you." When the police arrived at the hospital, Ricardo was already being taken away by hospital officers. Hugo watched as they put him in the patrol car. The doctor showed no fear, just let out a tired sigh and muttered before getting in, "I warned you that you wouldn't understand, Santa Maria." Hugo didn't respond, just clenched his fists and got into the police car. Ricardo's house was dark when they arrived. The police took out their guns and forced the door open. The smell of mold and dust filled the air. The house seemed empty, but Hugo felt that she was there. He followed the officers through the rooms, passing through the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms. Everything was in order, but there was something disturbing, a strange silence. That's when one of the policemen called out, "Down here!" Hugo ran down the hall. A door was ajar, and a staircase led to a dark basement. The smell there was even worse. When the police officers turned on their flashlights, Hugo saw something he would never forget. On the cold concrete floor, Juliana was lying unconscious, tied up, her face pale and her lips split. "We have a victim," one of the officers shouted. "Call an ambulance!" Hugo fell to his knees beside her. Juliana touched her face gently. She didn't react. Her breathing was weak, but she was alive. "Hang in there. You're going to make it." Minutes later, ambulance sirens blared outside. Paramedics rushed down, carrying a stretcher. Hugo took her hand tightly and ran alongside the paramedics as they lifted Juliana onto the stretcher and connected the emergency equipment. Her heart was still beating, but very weakly. She had a pulse, but it was unstable, shouted one of the paramedics. "Let's hurry!" Hugo got into the ambulance with them, held Juliana's cold hand, and stayed by her side the whole way. "Stay with me, Juliana. Your children need you." She didn't respond. Her face was still pale, her breathing irregular. The siren cut through the city streets. Every second seemed like an eternity. Hugo tried to ignore the fear growing inside him. He tried to believe that there was still hope. When they arrived at the hospital, the emergency doctors were already ready. "We're going to intubate her quickly." The team took Juliana inside. Hugo stood at the door watching them disappear down the hallways. He couldn't intervene because of his relationship to the case. He wanted to help. He wanted to do something. But for the first time, he felt powerless. Minutes passed, then hours. Dawn was breaking, and Hugo was still sitting there in the waiting room, unable to take his eyes off the emergency room door. Then it opened. The doctor in charge came out. His gaze said it all before he uttered a single word. Hugo stood up slowly. "No." The doctor took a deep breath. "We did everything we could, but she didn't make it. She was too weak." Hugo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The pain came like a strong, crushing blow to his chest. He ran his hands over his face, trying to hold back the tears. What happened to her? The doctor was holding a piece of paper in his hands. His voice was grave. The autopsy confirmed that Juliana had been sedated before she died. Hugo closed his eyes. Anger and sadness burned inside him. Juliana had no choice. She had no chance to fight. She was silenced. Now only her children remained, and Hugo knew he had to protect them at all costs. Hugo stood in the hospital hallway, staring at the floor, unable to move. The weight of the news was too great, too crushing. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears, but it was no use. A deep pain tightened his chest, as if he were drowning inside. Juliana was dead. He clenched his fists, feeling frustration burn in his body. He found her. He got her out of that house. He did everything he could, but it wasn't enough. He wasn't fast enough. A sob escaped his throat. He felt his legs give way and sat down on a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. "Forgive me, Juliana," he whispered. He remembered her pale little face, the way her lips trembled as she struggled to breathe. If he had arrived sooner, maybe she would still be there. Maybe she would be hugging her children now, telling them that everything would be all right. But there was no more, maybe. There were no more chances. She was gone. A nurse approached hesitantly. "Doctor, do you need anything?" Hugo shook his head and wiped his tears with the back of his hand. "I need Ricardo to pay for this." He got up slowly, took a deep breath, and walked to the reception desk. The police officer in charge of the case was there reviewing his notes. Hugo approached him, and his voice came out firm, laden with pain. "I want to be sure he stays in prison." The officer looked up at him. "After the autopsy and the witness testimony, we have enough to keep him in custody. He will be formally charged." Hugo nodded, but that brought him no peace. Nothing would bring Juliana back. He looked down the hallway leading to the neonatal ICU. Matteo and Gael were unaware of the tragedy that had just occurred. Those little ones were now alone in the world, and he would not allow them to be forgotten as well. Hours later, at the police station, Hugo stood watching from the other side of the glass, while Ricardo was handcuffed inside the police station room. The metallic sound of the handcuffs closing around his wrists should have given him some kind of relief, but it didn't. Ricardo wasn't desperate. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't try to defend himself. He just shrugged his shoulders, took a deep breath, and stood there still, as if all this were just another day. The police officer next to him asked the routine questions. Full name, age, occupation. Ricardo answered without hesitation, as if none of it mattered. Hugo felt his blood boil with each passing second. He wanted to understand how someone could be so cold. Then Ricardo looked up and stared directly at him through the glass. For a moment, there was silence. Then, without changing his expression, he muttered, "It was better this way." Those words hit Hugo like a punch. The cold, the lack of remorse was as if Juliana had never meant anything to him, as if those babies were just a problem that had to be disposed of. Hugo felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to scream. He wanted to ask why. How could someone have such an empty heart? How could he take the life of an innocent woman and almost let his own children die without feeling anything? But he said nothing. He just turned around and left the police station, feeling the weight of reality on his shoulders. Ricardo was in prison, but nothing would bring Juliana back. Now only her children remained. And Hugo knew he couldn't leave them alone in the world. Hugo returned to the hospital feeling a void inside him. The weight of everything that had happened still crushed his chest. Ricardo was in prison. Juliana was gone. And now all that remained were those two little ones sleeping in the neonatal unit, without even imagining that they were alone in the world. He entered the unit and stopped in front of the incubators. Matteo and Gael were more colorful and breathing better. They were fighting to live, but live for whom? Doña Estela approached, carrying a blanket in her hands. Her eyes were still red from crying so much. "What will happen to them, doctor?" Hugo remained silent. That was the question he had tried to avoid from the moment he knew Juliana would not return. He looked at the babies again. Small, fragile, innocent. "There is no family, no relatives who can take them in?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. Doña Estela shook her head. Juliana had no one, and on the father's side, well, no one wanted to know about the children. No one was close to Dr. Hugo. He closed his eyes for a moment. The pain grew inside him. Matteo moved slightly in the incubator. Hugo approached, and his hand, touching his little hand, his tiny fingers, they closed around his finger. Gael took a deep breath, as if he could feel his presence there. Hugo swallowed hard. He knew what it was like to grow up without anyone. He knew what it was like to feel alone, without a home, without a hug. Those babies had already lost so much, and now where would they go? To a shelter, to the system, where they would be just two more among so many. The pressure in his chest grew stronger. Hugo spent the night without sleep, sitting next to the incubators, watching Matteo and Gael breathe. Every movement they made, every small improvement made his heart tighten. He knew he had to make a decision, but fear paralyzed him. Being a doctor was his life, but being a father was something he had never thought about. He had never imagined himself responsible for a life beyond those he saved in the hospital. And now here were two babies who had no one left. Doña Estela appeared from time to time, leaving him food, even though she knew he barely ate. "You have to rest, doctor," she said with a worried look, but he didn't move from there. At the hospital, they were already beginning to question what would be done with the children. Social workers were involved in the process. It was bureaucratic, cold, impersonal. If no one from the family shows up to take them, they will be sent for adoption. explained one of the assistants. Hugo nodded, but those words remained going round and round in his mind. Sent where? With whom? They deserved more. They deserved love. They deserved someone who would be with them, not out of obligation, but because they loved them. On the fourth sleepless night, Hugo found himself holding both of them at the same time. Matteo curled up in one arm and Gael in the other. They were both sleeping peacefully, so small, so helpless. He looked at their faces and felt a lump in his throat. Matter the fear, the doubt, or anything else. He had already decided. The next morning, he walked into the social worker's office. She looked up from her computer and smiled slightly. "How can I help you, Dr. Hugo?" Hugo took a deep breath. "I want the woman." The woman blinked in surprise. "You mean take them in temporarily?" Hugo shook his head. "I don't want to be their father." The assistant was silent for a few seconds, studying his face. "Are you sure, Dr. Hugo? Taking care of 2 babies isn't easy." Hugo looked out the window, feeling his heart tighten. "They've already lost everything. I'm not going to let them lose more." The assistant smiled kindly and took out some papers. "Let's start the process." Hugo felt a chill in his stomach, but for the first time in a long time, he also felt peace. Matteo and Gael would not be alone. They would have a home. They would have a father. Time passed, and Hugo watched Matteo and Gael grow before his eyes. The first few months were difficult. He was torn between his work at the hospital and the early mornings spent rocking the 2 of them when they cried. He learned to change diapers, prepare bottles, and recognize each cry. Hunger, sleep, tantrum. The once silent house was now full of laughter. Toys were everywhere, and little hands tugged at his pants, asking to be picked up. Each of the children's achievements was a victory. Their first smile, the first word, the first steps. "Daddy!" Gail shouted one day, running toward him with open arms. Hugo froze. For a second, he had never thought that one day he would hear that word directed at him. He bent down and hugged them both, feeling his chest tighten with emotion. "Here I am, my children." But even though the house was filled with love, the past never completely disappeared. On the quietest nights, Hugo still thought about Juliana and how everything could have been different. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night with a weight on his chest, as if he could hear the whisper of what had been lost. On the children's birthdays, he would look at the candles on the cake and wonder what it would be like if Juliana were there, singing Las Mañanitas with them. He did everything he could to ensure that Matteo and Gael had a happy childhood, but inside, he carried the pain of knowing that one day he would have to tell them the truth. They would grow up and ask questions, and Hugo knew he couldn't hide it forever. The sun shone in the blue sky, and a light breeze ruffled Matteo and Gail's hair as they ran across the cemetery lawn, laughing carefree, holding small, colorful balloons in their hands. For them, it was just another special day. For Hugo, it was much more than that. 3 years since that terrible night. 3 years since Juliana left without having the chance to see her children grow up. Hugo walked slowly, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. When he reached the grave, he knelt down and ran his hand over the name engraved on the cold stone. Juliana Herrera, 21 years old, beloved mother. He took a deep breath. "Hello, Juliana." For a moment, he felt his throat close up. The memories came back like a movie in his mind. They are big and full of energy. You would fall in love with them. He looked back and saw Matteo and Gael playing, unaware of the importance of that moment. "They are fine, Juliana, and I will take care of them." He closed his eyes for a moment and felt the wind touch his face as if it were a silent answer. He leaned toward the tombstone and whispered with a heavy heart, "I promise you, they will be happy." "I promise you, Matteo." And Gail ran toward him, laughing, not understanding why their dad's eyes were full of tears. "Dad, look at our balloon," Hugo smiled, quickly wiping his eyes. "We released it into the sky." The children nodded excitedly. The 3 of them stood there side by side, watching the balloons rise slowly until they disappeared into the sky. At that moment, Hugo felt something different inside him. It wasn't just sadness. It was love. It was the certainty that Juliana would continue living through those 2 little ones. The years passed, but the pain never completely went away. Hugo experienced happy moments alongside Matteo and Gael. He saw their first days of school, their first drawings scribbled on the living room wall, the laughter that filled the house. He learned to prepare lunchboxes, to tell bedtime stories, to calm fevers in the middle of the night. But on quiet nights, when the house was peaceful and the children slept peacefully, he felt the weight of the past tighten his chest. The guilt never left him. He always wondered, what if he had arrived earlier? What if he had suspected sooner? What if he had managed to save her? He closed his eyes and saw Juliana's pale face, her fragile body on that hospital stretcher. He felt the cold of the basement where he found her, the desperation of trying to bring her back. But time does not return. The past cannot be changed. Hugo did everything he could. He saved her children and gave them a life full of love. But deep in his heart, he carried the weight of a broken promise. He wanted to have saved her too. Hugo knew he couldn't change the past, but he could do something for the future. The pain of losing Juliana never went away, but he decided to transform that pain into something that would really make a difference in the years to come. In addition to continuing his work as a doctor, he began to get involved in projects to support mothers at risk. He visited communities in need, helped pregnant women who had no support, and offered free care to women who, like Juliana, were vulnerable and had no one to protect them. He created a program within the hospital to ensure that no mother was ignored, that no woman disappeared without someone feeling her absence. Every life he saved was a small patch on the wound he carried in his chest. One night, while organizing documents, a young woman entered the office holding her already large, pregnant belly. She seemed nervous, her eyes full of fear. "Doctor, I don't know what to do." Hugo looked at her and saw a reflection of what Juliana could have been, a young woman, alone, scared, not knowing where to go. He took her hand gently and said firmly, "You are not alone. I will help you." The young woman cried with relief, and Hugo felt something different inside him for the first time in years. He felt he was fulfilling a promise. If he couldn't save Juliana, he would save as many women as he could, because none of them deserved the fate she had. The years passed quickly. Matteo and Gael were no longer the fragile babies Hugo had held in his arms for the first time. Now, they were two strong young men, full of life, with easy smiles and kind hearts. But there was a truth they didn't yet know. Hugo always knew this day would come. He always knew that at some point, he would have to look them in the eyes and tell them the story he had avoided that night. He called them to sit on the sofa. The atmosphere in the room was different, heavy. The boys noticed it. "What's wrong, Dad?" Gail asked. Hugo took a deep breath and looked at the two of them, their faces so similar, their curious eyes always seeking answers. "It's time for you to know about your mother." Matteo and Gael looked at each other. They knew little about her. Hugo had never hidden the fact that Juliana had died, but he had never gone into details. "What happened to her?" Matteo asked in a low voice. Hugo felt his chest tighten. His greatest fear had always been hurting them with the truth, but they had a right to know, so with a heavy heart, he told them. He talked about Juliana, about how young and dreamy she was. He told them about Ricardo, about the cruel man he had to protect them from, but tried to erase them. He explained how she disappeared, how he searched for her, how he arrived too late. Silence filled the room. Gael was the first to lower his head. "He wanted us to die," he murmured with a trembling voice. Matteo rubbed his eyes, holding back tears. "And she tried to protect us." Hugo felt a lump in his throat. "Yes, children. She loved you. She fought for you until the end." They both remained silent for a moment, taking it all in until suddenly Gael stood up and hugged Hugo tightly. "You didn't save Dad." Matteo followed immediately, holding back his tears as he hugged Hugo tightly. "You are our real dad." Hugo could no longer hold back his tears there in the middle of that tight hug. He realized that despite all the pain, they were together, and that was all that mattered. Hugo still felt the weight of the conversation in his chest. Matteo and Gael now knew the truth. They knew what they had survived, what their mother had suffered, what Ricardo tried to do. The three of them sat there on the sofa, silence filling the room. It was not an empty silence, but a silence of deep feelings, of emotions difficult to put into words. Matteo looked at Hugo, his eyes still shining with tears. He took a deep breath, took his dad's hand, and squeezed it tightly. She left, her voice trembling but full of gratitude. "But you saved us." Hugo felt his heart tighten. Gail, sitting next to him, put an arm around his shoulder and rested his head there as he did when he was a child. "We were never alone, because we always had you." Hugo blinked several times, trying to contain his emotion, but it was useless. A tear ran down his face. "He would do all over again," he whispered. "I would give my life for you." Matteo and Gael leaned over at the same time and hugged him. At that moment, Hugo realized that despite all the pain he carried, he had accomplished his mission. The boys were there, alive and strong, and above all, beloved Hugo still felt the warmth of the children's embrace when Gael lifted his face and looked him straight in the eyes. His eyes were filled with tears, but also with something else, a certainty of love. Gael grabbed Hugo's hand tightly, as if he wanted those words to never be forgotten. "You are our real dad." That phrase touched Hugo's heart deeply. He felt as if he couldn't breathe. For a second, he had spent so much time believing that he wasn't enough, that perhaps he could never fill the void that Juliana had left. But there, in that moment, he realized that it was never about blood, but about love. Matteo smiled, his eyes still teary, and agreed with his brother. "It was always you, Dad." Hugo closed his eyes and took a deep breath. A lump formed in his throat. "I love you with all my heart." The children leaned in again and hugged him tightly. Hugo realized that for the first time in many years, the pain gave way to something greater. There, in that room with the children that life had put in his path, he finally felt peace. Hugo looked at Matteo and Gael and felt his heart warm. For so many years, he had carried the pain of what had happened to Juliana, the weight of guilt, the fear of never being enough, but there, hugging his children, he understood something he had never allowed himself to see before. Despite everything, something beautiful was born from the tragedy. He found the children he never imagined he would have. He learned to love in a way he never knew was possible. He became more than a doctor, more than a man trying to correct a mistake from the past. He became a father. Every laugh from them, every little "I love you, Daddy," every night he put them to bed, all of that was proof that love won. Fate was cruel to Juliana, but her children were not left alone. They were saved, they were protected, they were loved, and as Hugo hugged them there, feeling the children's hearts beating next to his, he knew that his mission was never just to save lives, it was to give them meaning. Matteo and Gael grew up showing curiosity about their dad's work. They would sit on the sofa waiting for him to come back from the hospital. They asked him questions about his patients and played with a toy stethoscope. "When we grow up, can we be doctors like you?" Matteo once asked, his eyes shining with excitement. Hugo smiled and ruffled his hair. "You can be whatever you want, kids." But over time, they both realized that they didn't want to be just anything. "Doctors like you?" Matteo asked once, his eyes shining with excitement. Hugo smiled and ruffled his hair. "You can be whatever you want, sons." But over time, they both realized they didn't want to be just anything. They wanted to save lives. When they finished school, there was no doubt. Matteo and Gael entered medical school. Hugo felt such immense pride that he couldn't describe it. During their years of study, he saw their effort, the early mornings without sleep, their trembling hands during their first practice at the hospital, and whenever they felt afraid, he was there. "Dad, what if I'm not good enough?" Gail asked one night, looking at the books scattered on the table. Hugo approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. "I had that same fear, son. But you know what made me keep going?" Gail nodded, waiting for the answer. "Knowing that every patient I saved could be someone else's, Matteo or Gael." On graduation day, when the two received their diplomas, Hugo's eyes filled with tears. Not only had they achieved their goal, they had chosen a path that would keep alive the promise he made years ago. Matteo and Gael were not just survivors. They were living proof that love and kindness can turn even the worst pain into something great. The hospital was very busy that morning. But for Hugo, everything seemed to be in slow motion. He stood there in the hallway, watching from afar as Mateo and Gael put on their white coats for the first time. Watching from afar as Mateo and Gael put on their white coats for the first time. The two looked at each other, nervous and excited at the same time. It was the first day of their medical residency, the first day of a new chapter. Hugo felt a lump in his throat. It seemed like yesterday when he held those fragile children in his arms, not knowing if they would survive. Now they were there, strong, ready to save lives, just as he had done for them. Mateo adjusted his gown, looked at his brother, and then at Hugo, who was watching them from afar. Gael smiled and walked toward him, stopping right in front of him. "Dad, this is for you." Mateo put a hand on his brother's shoulder and nodded. "If we are here today, it is because you believed in us." Hugo tried to respond, but the emotion stopped him for a moment. He took a deep breath, feeling his chest fill with something he had never felt before. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace, a true, light peace, unlike anything he had ever experienced. He looked at his sons with eyes full of tears and smiled at them sincerely. "You are already so much more than I could ever have dreamed of." Mateo and Gael hugged their father at the same time, just as they had done when they were children. Months later, the sound of the ambulance siren echoed through the hospital. The emergency alert sounded through the loudspeakers, and the nurses rushed to prepare the room. Mateo and Gael were on duty that day. They wore their white coats, stethoscopes around their necks, their eyes attentive to every call. But when they heard the voice on the radio saying, "Newborn in critical condition on the way," they felt something different inside them. They looked at each other for a brief second and, without saying a word, ran together to the emergency room. The stretcher was pushed hurriedly inside. On the small mattress wrapped in a light blue blanket, a baby was struggling to breathe. His cry was weak, almost non-existent. "What do we have?" Mateo asked, quickly putting on his gloves. They found him abandoned. "He has signs of hypothermia and malnutrition," replied one of the nurses. Gael placed the stethoscope on the baby's chest and listened to the faint heartbeat. That little heart was fighting just as they once did. "We're going to stabilize him. We need to warm him up and start fluids." The two moved in sync. It wasn't just professionalism, it was something bigger. Hugo watched everything from afar. He felt a lump in his throat as he watched his children there, saving a life as he once did. It was as if history was repeating itself, but this time, they were the ones there to prevent an innocent child from being forgotten. Mateo took the baby's little hand and whispered softly, as if making a promise, "You're going to be okay, little one. We're here." Hugo stood at the emergency room door watching Mateo and Gael work with precision, with care, with the same love he put into every life he tried to save. Mateo adjusted the apparatus. Gael monitored the vital signs. The baby was breathing better, reacting to the touch of those careful hands that now protected him. Hugo felt his eyes fill with tears. He looked up as if somewhere beyond what he could see, Juliana was there watching. A light breeze blew through the hallway, and Hugo closed his eyes. For a moment, feeling that soft warmth inside his chest, wherever he was, he knew that Juliana could finally rest in peace. And what would you do in his place? Could you have been in Hugo's place and changed the fate of 2 babies? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with new stories. The videos on the screen are perfect for you, so be sure to check them out.